All right, well, it's noon. Let me say welcome to everyone again. We are streaming live on Facebook. We are also here in the Zoom meeting. Glad to see so many participants, so many people joining us for this presentation. Really a pleasure to welcome all of you. I am Meg Fowler, and I am happy to, again, to welcome all of you. Today, for today's Learning Lunch program, we are going to hear from Sehoy Thrower, the Environmental Protection Specialist for the Poarch Creek Indians. And before I introduce her, I have a few announcements to make for the History Museum. We are, of course, open at the History Museum. We have enhanced our cleaning procedures of the building, of course, require that visitors wear masks like everywhere else, maintain social distance from other groups. It's a really good socially distant thing to do. So if you are ready to be out and about, the History Museum is a great place to do that. Our special exhibition, Ancient Rome, the Empire That Shaped the World, really wonderful exhibition, has been extended and will be at the museum through Labor Day. So if you haven't yet gotten a chance, I know so many of you that are joining us here have, if you hadn't gotten a chance to see Ancient Rome, you have a little bit extra time and one more free Sunday to do so. So hope you will join us there. We also just opened an exhibit called Trench Art, and it's an exhibit of, trench art is a term that means any kind of art that was created from the implements of war by those involved in the war effort. So think, soldiers making carvings on bullet casings, that sort of thing. The small exhibit, if you know the museum, it's right at the top of the stairs on the second floor, but really kind of beautiful, interesting art of World War II. And so kind of a different take on the art of war, right? On something that you might not think about with World War II. So that will be up for a couple months. Just opened, encourage you to come see that as well. Also have on the exhibit front one really exciting announcement to make, and that is that the History Museum has secured a really exceptional exhibit for next spring. It's called Egyptian Mummies and Eternal Life. It's going to open at the end of February for 4 months, end of February to end of June. In 2021, real Egyptian mummies along with all of the implements of the afterlife of mummification. These are coming from a museum in Italy, coming from somewhere else in North America. Most recently, though, really extraordinary exhibit. Hope you will join us for that. We're also offering history to-go kits. Currently at the museum, these have been really popular. Right now we have African masks available and quill pens, everything you need in a brown bag to come pick up. Activity for maybe a child in your family or a neighbor. They're completely free. All you have to do is stop by the museum, grab one at the front desk. Really been popular and so happy to be able to do that. Before I introduce Ms. Thrower, I want to remind everyone, I'm going to do this a couple times just so everyone hears, that we will welcome questions. We will get to questions at the end, and there are two ways to ask questions. The first, if you're joining us on Zoom, is to type a question in the chat. And so if you see at the bottom of the screen, if you're on a desktop, for most people, it's at the bottom of the screen, there's a little icon that says chat. And if you click on that, you can type a question, we'll see it, and then be able to ask those questions at the end. There we go. We've got a question that just popped up, so you can see what that looks like in the chat box. If you're joining us on Facebook, type a question in the comments. We'll be checking there too. And as we go through, I'll look at those and ask those at the end. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Sehoy Thrower, who grew up learning traditional plant uses from her Creek family and went on to study ecology in school. Along with protecting the tribe's natural resources, her job involves teaching ecological knowledge to youth from a cultural and scientific perspective. She also shares the land use history of the Poarch Creek Indians and imparts knowledge of how it shaped their culture and knowledge of medicinal plants to this day. Today, she'll be sharing the ethnobotanical history of the tribe and the specific practices that have been preserved up to the present. Once more, if you have any questions, remember to put them in the chat box if you're on Zoom, in the comments if you're on Facebook. And we're so happy to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank y'all so much for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. Yeah, my name is Sehoy Thrower, and I'm here to talk about ethnobotany of the Poarch Creek Indians. So we are the only federally recognized tribe in Alabama. We're about a 45-minute drive to Mobile, and been through a lot of hardship over the centuries, but things have really turned around in recent years for us. The 1930s, that picture there shows Episcopalian missionaries really helping out the tribe at that time. In the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of revitalization efforts. You can see them there playing stickball, revitalizing that old sport. And to this day, we're still doing that, still playing stickball and trying to revitalize a lot of parts of our culture that were gone or barely hanging on by a thread. You can see traditional clothing on the left there. So when people talk about ethnobotany, a lot of times they just tend to think of medicinal plants or things from the woods. But I think it's really important to talk about food first and foremost, because food is medicine. Food is preventative medicine. So I'm going to kind of dive into pre-colonial agriculture and kind of tie it together from there. So a disclaimer that I like to put out there is just kind of a vocabulary cultural note. A Dolofa is a village. A Dolwa is an assemblage of villages back in the day. And way back when, there really was no Creek Nation, or Muskogee is really the language and the word, Muskogee Nation. That was formed way later on after European encroachment. Really, this area that we refer to as Creek territory was a lot more fluid and complex than people tend to give credit for. There was a lot of ethnic groups and languages and clan identities and things going on, and people really identified more with their Dolwa and their clan than they did as this kind of idea of being part of the Creek Nation. And usually people spoke, multiple languages. But to this day, fast forward, they did unify and adopt a Creek identity. And that was the last language spoken by our tribe, Muskogee Creek. And it tends to be what we gravitate towards, even though we have really more of an ethnically diverse Southeastern Indigenous background. So I'm going to use the word Muskogee and Creek interchangeably when I talk about the language through this presentation. So way back when all these Dolwas and Southeastern cultures were coexisting in this landscape here in Alabama, they were growing food very early on, cultivating domestic crops. And we tend to always think of corn as first and foremost when we think of native food. And that makes sense. Corn was a major player. But before there was corn cultivated, brought up from Mesoamerica, there were actually native cultigens for a very long time. Corn was brought in 200 BC. So that was what, right about here, somewhere in here. Look at all this time that there were native cultigens being domesticated and used for agriculture. Some of these things were a native sunflower, marsh elder, really early varieties of squash and gourds. And those are really good for seeds rich in oil. And then other things are cultivated for making flowers like knotweed and barley and maygrass, goosefoot. Just to kind of show you what some of them look like, you'll recognize them as weeds in your garden today. Goosefoot is really particularly nutritional, a really good spinach substitute in the leaves. There's the sumpweed, little barley maygrass. Now, if you wanted to try today to go find those weeds, harvest those seeds and use them like they used to, you're going to have a hard time, because what you see today are the wild cousins of those old domesticated cultigens from way back when. So back in the day, they had traits that were bred that made them easy to harvest and use and were more efficient. Nowadays, their wild varieties are a little tricky to work with. But they fell out of fashion for corn. And if it wasn't for corn, which is Utsi and Creek, if it wasn't for corn, you would never have Moundville or Etowah or Okmulgee or all these huge town centers and mound building societies that built up at the height of sophistication in our native culture. I mean, corn just allowed for so much to happen. And I put beans and squash with it because they were always grown together. Almost every indigenous group in this hemisphere who grew corn often grew corn, beans, and squash together. Kind of a holy trinity. A lot of people call it three sisters, but I'll get into that a little bit more later. But corn is so important that it's actually the basis of a lot of our ceremonies. It's the basis of our calendar. When the new corn of the year is ready to harvest, that's actually our new year. So around the time of what we call our green corn ceremony, we actually say Happy New Year. And green corn ceremony is a really important part of my life, and that's a very traditional, ancient Creek practice. So, early researchers found abandoned fields by southeastern Indians, and they just kind of assumed that it was something called swidden agriculture, which you see in a lot of tribal societies through the world. That's where you grow crops for a few years and let it lie fallow for a good while before you come back to it. Well, that only really works when you have a staple crop with low fertility demands like root vegetables. But corn was a staple crop here, and corn is a really heavy feeder on the soil. So you kind of are faced with this conundrum. You know, southeastern tribes rotated land less, they left land fallow for a shorter amount of time, and yet they were using a very heavy feeder crop. So how is that possible? Well, most people would answer, okay, well, fertilizer. That's the answer. That's how you deal with that situation. Well, there's actually no evidence that southeastern or any eastern tribes use fertilizer at all, except maybe, you know, ashes occasionally for certain things like gourds that really like that. I put Squanto here because it's such a myth that Squanto taught the pilgrims how to fertilize their food by putting fish in the mountain. No, that's not true. Squanto was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Europe and then escaped back to North America. And it's actually probably in Europe where he picked that up and was known for, you know, using it. No, the solution wasn't fertilizer. It was where they farmed. It was riverine land. So they would find the rich bottom land along the course of rivers, and that soil was perfect. It was easy to till, easy to use, perfect drainage for corn. And the most important thing is that it would periodically flood and renew nutrients. The deposits of silt would come back and bring nutrients in. So in a way, it was kind of a built-in fertilizing system. Some of you may already know this, but the birdhouse gourds that you see around the South all the time are totally an old pest control practice by corn-growing people in the Southeast and all over America. These gourds are perfect houses for purple martins, which are aggressive to birds that are terrible pests to newly planted corn seed. So they were very picky about where they grew most of their food on those perfect bands of land along the river, and those soils were scarce and, you know, limited. So they had other techniques that were really important: intercropping and multicropping. And intercropping is just a fancy word for exactly what I talked about earlier: growing corn, beans, and squash together. It's again what they call the Three Sisters technique, although that's not a thing that Creek people used, not a phrase they used. I don't know what tribe that came from, but in modern times, a lot of us do say the Three Sisters garden. And the reason for that, if you don't know, is corn grows like a pole, and beans climb it like a pole. It gives the beans support. Corns, like I said earlier, heavy feeders, they need a lot of nitrogen, and beans fix nitrogen in their roots, so it helps the corn in that way. And squash leaves are really irritating, so it does help keep pests out, but they're also very big and they provide an active living mulch around it. So those three just brilliantly grow together, and it's a very efficient way to grow lots of food in one place. And sunflowers are often grown on the north side, kind of like a wall around it. That's one that I grew, a Three Sisters patch a few years ago. They also, you know, this far south, you have a really long growing season, so there was, you know, multiple cropping. There was your early corn and your late corn, and you had multiple harvests in one year. But also, they didn't need so much of that scarce land to grow these cultivated, annually grown crops, because a lot of their food came from hunting, fishing, and gathering wild foods. I mean, look at this amount of time. From here, by the way, that early date is wrong. We were here much longer than that. But from here to when corn was introduced, I mean, that's a lot of time. That's millennia of just knowing your ecosystem so well. I mean, think about it. They had to get their calories entirely from wild foods and native collagens. And so the sad thing is we'll never know the full sophistication of pre-Columbian knowledge of the environment. I mean, so much has been lost over time. One case study that was done by a tribe up at the Great Lakes up north showed that they typically, and this was, you know, young people, not just medicine men or women, just regular people, they utilized about 400 to 500 plants in their environment. And they knew how to use 20% of all vascular plants in their environment in some way. And you can assume that that number would be even higher for southeastern tribes because there's more biodiversity here compared to up there. I mean, just look at this biodiversity hotspot map and think back on what I said about our territory, Creek Nation. I mean, we live in a very, very biodiverse state. Even when it comes to corn, knowing how to use your environment and wild foods plays a really important role in traditional cooking. You know, Hispanic people, a lot of them are very significantly native, and they still have native food practices that totally match the old southeastern way of cooking too. You go to the Hispanic section of your grocery store and you find hominy and masa. That is just purely traditional Indian cooking right there, because what that is corn with wood ashes. Well, in this case, it's probably bicarbonate from seashells, but you can use wood ashes or seashells to create a lye solution to treat corn in. It's called nixtamalization. And it's really important. It was a big part of the diet because it makes corn more easily ground. It increases nutritional value, the flavor, and it removes those harmful fungal mycotoxins. But it depended on knowing about your environment and your wild foods. Blackjack oak and post oak were the best for finding ash lye and making that. Now you can really use any kind of wood ash in a pinch, and see, in places in Europe where they took the corn seed and it became a staple crop, a lot of people had food deficiencies. They developed pellagra because that's a niacin deficiency. So if they had actually listened to this indigenous wisdom and knowledge that came along with taking that crop, and if they had paid attention to that, they wouldn't have had so many problems. But then there's so much more, like I said, to corn, with wild foods. And, you know, the autumn and winter time, you've got your hickory nuts, walnuts, chinkapins. My great-grandmother loved to just snack on chinkapins right off the tree. Acorns, more bitter, you have to leach them out, but they're important food stuff. Persimmons are shown right here, and this is the prickly pear cactus fruit. And then you have ground cherries, sumac, and sparkleberries. Sparkleberries don't taste very good, but good fiber, I guess. Sumac is probably one of my favorites. It's such a good flavor. I love lemon flavors, and it's a great substitute for that, and it also is high in vitamin C. You can make really great Indian lemonade out of it. But you gotta be careful not to get poison sumac. Look for that very red, velvety look in the berry, not the off-white color. You don't want that. Ground cherry, you might recognize that as a weed. You might hate it because it's a weed, but it's an edible weed. Those fruits turn into a very kind of interesting but sweet flavor when it gets cold. And if you ever were kind of brainstorming the things you wanted to plant that were native, disease resistant, suited to this climate, here's a great list if you want a screenshot of spring, summer wild fruits that are available here and that have been used forever. Muscadine, I love muscadines. They're so high in antioxidants. They're so well suited to the intense sun and heat and humidity and diseases of this area, and they transfer those good defense abilities onto you by giving you antioxidants. I mean, I saw some research where they were showing muscadine vinegars having out of this world antioxidant values compared to other vinegar sources. So there's all kind of ways we can incorporate this stuff in our diet and be healthier. It's poorly preserved in archaeology because obviously roots decompose very easily, so we don't have this strong documented understanding what roots were available. But in talking to elders and piecing together kind of common knowledge, there's a lot of roots and tubers available all year round that people would use. Let's see, we got smilax, very common. You'll see this all the time. And if you can find the roots when they're young and small still and more tender-like, it can make a really fine flour. Like you can make smilax jello. No joke. Groundnut, my grandmother loved groundnut. That's probably my favorite one of these roots and tubers as a potato substitute. See, native people genetically have for so long been following the diet that we're kind of discussing here, and in the modern diet just completely threw them for a loop. And a lot of people have really terrible rates of diabetes. So it's really important to think about low glycemic index substitutes to certain things. And this is a great example of that. Much lower GI than a potato, but it tastes really just like a potato when you cook it. So a lot of Eastern tribes maintain food forests. When Europeans came over here, they thought that Native people were just lucky to live in such a paradise, such a resource-rich paradise, but they really didn't give the indigenous people credit for how much they were being land stewards. It took a lot on Native people's behalf to create so much food, fuel, and fiber and medicine in the forest. And they did that namely through prescribed burning, intentional fire put on the ground. It's a big deal. They would selectively cut and propagate certain trees and promote seeds and dispersal, and it just took a lot of detailed understanding of seasonal cycles to accomplish this the right way. Really important knowledge to keep going to this day. There we go. Longleaf pine is really fire dependent to thrive as an ecosystem. And look here, in this map, the Creek territory. Look how much we're embedded in the historical range of longleaf pine. Obviously, this was a really important habitat, mainly for hunting. I mean, if you prescribe burns through longleaf pine, you're going to have open park-like stands, which is what the European colonizers observed. And it's great for deer to navigate through. It gives them a lot of open area. And river cane, they were giant, what they call cane breaks. They're basically just bamboo forests. This is our native bamboo, and it gets really big. In Mobile, you're going to tend to see more switch cane, but you might see some old river cane still hanging on, usually on river bluffs. But a lot of the range, like 98% or something like that, of the range of longleaf pine and river cane have been totally decimated to make way for cotton fields and agricultural land. But these habitats are really important for not just the ecology of the South, but also our crafts and our traditional skills. I mean, look at this flute here, made out of bamboo. They make flutes, blowguns. Weaving was the big thing with river cane. You can make all kind of mats and wall coverings, baskets. It was a big deal. And longleaf pine, it's really not well documented in an archaeological sense that we had a lot of pine needle baskets and all that, but I mean, it's just such an excellent thing to weave with and make art out of. It's just so perfectly made for that, and it was so abundant that you can pretty much assume that that was an important craft skill. I mean, I have a good friend, a brilliant artist, who made this, for example, out of pine needles, and there's no reason to assume that this wasn't done pre-colonially. I mean, all you do is get some fiber and dye it and weave it in. I mean, of course they were doing things like that. It can just be assumed. Here, in case you're interested in that sort of thing, like textiles, mulberry tree, along with being a really great fruit to eat, the bark of the tree was a really important fiber for making fabric out of. And a lot of indigenous people with mulberry trees through the world do that. This picture, which I'm sorry, I didn't realize how blurry it was, this is actually tapa cloth from Hawaii. And Native people there have kept this old craft intact a little bit longer, and they're really good at it. So I took a kind of modern example from Hawaii to show what sort of thing could be accomplished and what was sort of done back then to make things like wrap skirts and whatever. Bear grass and dogbane are just a few examples of very fibrous plants that you can make cordage out of, and if you're really patient and crafty, you can really twine it and make it into great materials for all kind of textile projects. And you can dye it. I didn't really talk about dye in my presentation. You could do a whole presentation just on coloring and dyes, but if you want to know what sort of dyes you can make these colors out of, I would say pokeweed, pokeberry would make a very good pinkish, and bloodroot make a great red. Those are just some examples. If you want more details on that, just ask me. Oh, I can read these Creek words to you too. I meant to do that. Mulberry is gi, beargrass is solina, dogbane, pinoki, yichu. I'm not sure if that is exactly for dogbane, but this basically means a strong string, pinoki string. So I think that that's appropriate for what they call dogbane, or Indian hemp, as it's called. Speaking of, jewelry and beads and sort of that thing, it's Chinaberry, I would say, is the thing that in modern Poarch Creek culture, everybody knows about and loves. People love making Chinaberry necklaces. I grew up with it. They're so easy to dye and make different colors, and the tree is everywhere. Great, but the problem is that it's not native. It's really invasive, this tree. It wasn't here until Europeans brought it over. And I have very mixed feelings about it in that way. Ecologically, I hate it because it displaces native plants. But I also grew up making Chinaberry necklaces, so kind of a strange relationship I have with this tree, the Konapaga. That means it resembles a beet. I love this picture because you can see here where fire had come through. Describe burn from the tree on the pine trees. But you know, the reason a lot of our elders knew a lot about folk medicine is because it's a basic necessity, right? Like a lot of things in our culture from 1900 to 2000, you know, this last century, fizzled out. Unfortunately, our language fizzled out. The songs and dances, those sort of things at our reservation just fell out of practice because there was such pressure to assimilate with modern Western culture. I mean, people were afraid to practice the culture. They were so threatened. But yeah, knowledge of folk medicine is obviously so important because when you're discriminated by local doctors and your loved ones are sick, you're going to retain some of that knowledge of how to treat and help people. Mullein is something my grandmother loved. The Creek word is waga anhiji, which means cow tobacco. So obviously it's something that they smoked. It's good for certain lung problems. But it's also not native. It's a modern thing. In a sense, because it was brought over by Europeans, but it's so useful. And unlike the Chinaberry tree, which is also not a native plant, the mullein is polite. You know, it's not invasive. It doesn't take over and displace native plants. It's a polite little plant, and it's helpful. So I really enjoy mullein. You find it a lot where old homesteads used to be. And yeah, we've been mixing old and new, imported, native for a long time in Creek culture. Just like with the plants. I mean, see here with the clothing too. At the height of Creek fashion, you know, we had glass beads and silver and cotton cloth mixed in with really ornate, meaningful cultural symbolism that's ancient, you know, mixed in. Every piece of their clothing has meaning, I promise you. And that just shows how Creek people have been developing a very unique identity of blending the old and new for a long time now. And I firmly believe that Alabama could have been a multicultural melting pot of Creek ideas and new ideas. You could have had Creek radio stations and all this cool stuff, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way, you know. The American government was very harsh, and Andrew Jackson's administration took it to a horrifying level of exterminating and displacing the Creek Nation and of the other southeastern tribes as well. So, you know, his administration catalyzed the Trail of Tears, and that's why today most Creek people are in Oklahoma. The vast majority of Creek people are in Oklahoma, and a lot of them are in the Seminole Nation too, of Florida. So we're a very tiny pocket of Creek people left in the homeland here. And even then, I mean, it's not really our indigenous mother town territory. We're kind of put on reservation land, a little off the map. So most people are in Oklahoma. I myself go to Oklahoma to participate in traditional ceremony. And so I consider Oklahoma kind of the cultural epicenter of the Creek Nation, right? And that being said, for ethnobotany, there's certain plants that don't grow in Oklahoma that are still growing here in the homeland. So Yopon, classic example, because it doesn't grow in Oklahoma, but this plant used to have really important ceremonial value. But we don't use it that way anymore. We don't use it in a ceremonial sense because it completely fell out of practice in Oklahoma, here as well. But it grows abundantly here. So even though I don't use it in a ceremonial way, I do drink it very casually. It makes a great tea, and it's the only source of caffeine in North America. So I enjoy it. Cedar is a really important tree. Oh, I meant to say them in Creek. Ussie is how you say this in Creek. Cedar of Chena and Creek. This is a really important one spiritually speaking. I mean, you see it since time immemorial in art and old ancient art being depicted as sort of a tree of life and just having very intense spiritual meaning. In fact, you can see it in my office behind me. I have a kind of display of that. Rabbit tobacco, aholabotki, same thing. Very spiritually important plant. And I'm not a medicine woman by any means, never pretend to be. And it's not my place to really discuss that type of thing. But I do think it's really important to me to discuss those plants on a spiritual way, only because my great-great-grandmother used them. And what a lot of people call smudging nowadays, to kind of cleanse homes and that sort of thing, she used those plants in that way. And that's still how they're used in Oklahoma. And when that dawned on me, that connection, that cross-cultural connection, I thought that was so beautiful. And I thought it was a great example of how our Poarch Creek community up until like the 1960s was still assigning spiritual value to plants. I mean, yeah, of course we had a lot of folk medicine practices still in place to treat symptoms of things. But to have that spiritual value assigned to plants as part of our old culture still alive in the Poarch Creek community at some point is so important to me. And that's why it's very important for me to pick up that torch for my family and keep it going and fuel that fire. Important for me to go out to attend ceremonies in Oklahoma and to pick up the language and revitalize it. My great-great-grandmother who used those plants also happened to be the last speaker of Creek in my family. So, you know, I kind of see myself as trying to pick up that torch. And I couldn't talk about her without talking about other people in my family. I had a lot of people in my family to thank for the path I'm on, but particularly my grandmother depicted in the middle, who is the granddaughter of the lady on the left, and then my father on the right. They really took it upon themselves to pick up that torch as well, and they really instilled in me appreciating traditional values and knowledge and seeking more knowledge at all times, asking elders. So yes, I have a college degree and I work for the tribe, but what really, and I ask elders questions all the time, but what really put me on the path I am to be here discussing this with you is my family and these people who paved the path. That's sort of my late introduction to myself, late in the game here. But sweet gum tree, Hologaby, I like talking about this one because it's a great example of when elders sometimes know half the story. I was talking to this one elder of our tribe, and he said when he was little, he had seizures really bad, and his mother kept going to the sweet gum tree to try to use it to treat him, make him better. She tried the root and the leaves and the bark and all these parts of the tree, but nothing ever worked. He said it just didn't work. So I always thought about that story and just wondered about it. But I was just kind of randomly looking through research on the sweet gum tree, and I came across some abstract that said something about using the seeds inside of those sweet gum balls for seizure treatments. And this was a modern scientific journal. And it dawned on me, you know, he or his mother knew the right plant. She just didn't know what part of the plant. You know, so those sort of details are so important with maintaining traditional ecological knowledge. It's really important to know what part of the plant, what time of the year, how you harvest it, how you prepare it, what's the dosage. The wild cherry tree is a classic example of why it's so important to know those things, because this tree can really hurt you, but it can also really help you. So please don't take anything I talk about from this presentation and just attempt it casually, because everything takes a lot of research and knowledge to know how to do it safely. And you know, the cherry tree, for example, the inner orange bark is a great medicine for a dry, irritating cough. But if you accidentally use the leaves, especially if they're kind of wilted or fermented parts of the bark, that's a lot of cyanide in your system, and you can really hurt yourself. So very important to know what you're doing exactly. Sassafras was huge in the Poarch Creek community. In fact, a lot of people now I talk to kind of like, when they hear it, because their grandmothers made them drink it every spring because it's supposed to be good for you. They always said it, thins your blood, whatever that means. But it's a very unique plant, easy to identify because it's got 3 different leaves on the tree. It's got the simple one with no lobes, it's got the mitten shape, and the trident shape. But yeah, the root is what they make the tea out of, and it's a great thing. Also, the leaves are a good thickener in stew. That's where the original gumbo filet ingredient comes from. And that word is wiso in Muskogee. So elderberry here, which is Toscoliba, modern medicine has really shown this to be a very effective antiviral treatment, the berries particularly. But you don't really want to eat them raw in too many quantities. Kind of got harmful stuff, but if you cook it down, that'll make it completely safe to drink and eat. Bull nettle, that's kind of a funny one that a lot of old folks still talk about because it is called the Indian Viagra. And that's about all I'm going to say about that. And yellow root, this is sort of talked about like a cure-all. I mean, people ask me all the time, what was yellow root used for? And I'm like, I don't even know where to start. I just heard so many things. I've heard anti-cancer, arthritis, good for dental problems. The sad thing about it is because it was talked about as sort of this cure-all, it's really been over-harvested in our area. It's incredibly hard to come by. I come by it really easily when I go up north a little bit in the state. I can find it, no problem. But around here, it's just completely over-harvested because a lot of tribal people here at Poarch actually would gather it and sell it to the outside community for money when they were really impoverished. Beauty berry has a very beautiful berry. But the berry's not really the very useful part. You don't really get much out of eating it at all. It doesn't taste good. It's not good for you. It doesn't really hurt you, but you don't eat the berry so much. The leaves, though, have been shown in modern research to be a great insect repellent. Some research I showed it was at 80% as effective as DEET, some of the chemicals in there. So that's pretty darn good for a natural remedy for insect repellent. I'm still experimenting with it to see kind of what's the best method. If you try it out in some ways, boil it down, mix it with oil, I don't know how you might do it, but let me know how it works for you. I'm curious what's the best way to use beauty berry for insect repellent. I mean, of course, walking in the woods growing up, and you just wipe the leaf on you. And another one my grandmother was big on for that was a sassafras leaf. You find a leaf and just rub it on you to help with the bugs. And willow. Willow is kind of the all-important medicine plant, and it's very easy to see why. It's where aspirin comes from. You know, it's nature's pain reliever. Literally, the compounds in willow are what is used in today's aspirin. It's just concentrated in the medicine form today. Aquana is that Greek word. But, you know, it has so much more meaning than just being a pain reliever. In the ceremonial sense, it has a lot of spiritual value to it too. But in terms of just, you know, you using it, whatever, all willow plants have it, some stronger than others. But yeah, all parts of the plant, they have these compounds that can be used. It's just a painkiller. So that's pretty much what I have. Mado means thank you. So Mado for coming and listening to me. And now I will take any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much. We are so excited to, really a wonderful presentation, and we'll need some help getting my video. Let's see, hold on, here we go. There we are. Thank you again so much. That was a fascinating presentation. We had, really has sparked so many things, even in my own mind. All of a sudden, I'm brainstorming a native garden at our colonial fort, and like all these incredible possibilities. But we do have some questions. Let me get to those. We've had some come in on Zoom and on Facebook. I'll go ahead and remind everyone, if you are joining us on Zoom, you can type questions in the chat. If you're joining us on Facebook, if you put a question in the comments, and we're gonna get to those. But first of all, thank you again. What a really interesting and fabulously informative presentation. One question from Nancy says, has the Baldwin County GMO corn affected the seed stock of the tribe?
Okay, so we don't actually grow heirloom Creek corn, and the whole discussion of having an heirloom seed saved corn that's unique to a Creek identity is a very complicated subject. And some people that are good to talk to about it are some folks out at the Muskogee Food Sovereignty Initiative in Oklahoma who are involved with that project. And there's some people in Alabama who are seed savers, the Sand Mountain Seed Bank folks, and people associated with them, who are trying to figure out what is the best seed variety that closely matches Old Creek varieties. So that's kind of an ongoing subject. And so the short answer is no. We don't really have a seed stock that it could mess with. But absolutely, other corns would interfere with that if we were seed saving corn like that.
Wonderful. All right, we've got some comments and some questions from Dr. Deidre Dees, who says these are great details, shares lots of compliments, great details to know about plant usage. I love the weaving. She says, could we get a picture of Chippy Rollin'? We don't have that in our archive, so I'll let y'all coordinate on that. But then she also asks, can you eat China berries?
No. Don't eat the China berries. You'll be hurting.
Good to
Yeah,
know.
Dr. Dees, I will definitely get that picture to you. I didn't know you didn't have it. I will, yeah, I'll email it to you after this.
We've got one question from Terry Mannion, who says, do air and water pollutants affect the natural properties of plants?
They can, not on like a genetic level so much, but yeah, they can totally contaminate certain plants. Yeah, like you gotta be really careful with certain pesticides. For sure, though, they have, you want to check out something called the soil and water activity on them, because plants can uptake them and it can kill lots of plants that you don't mean to intentionally kill when you improperly apply that sort of thing. So yeah, certain things can absolutely show up in what you eat and what you use in plants that were pollutants.
So from Facebook, we have some comments from a woman named Denise Wright asking, she was asking at the very beginning of your talk, and I think this question got answered as you went, are you related to the late Robert Thrower? And I'm thinking that was your father. Is that right?
Yeah, the guy that was on the right in the purple shirt in the middle of the presentation, yeah, that was him. Mm-hmm.
So you no doubt when we're done here and when you get a chance, she had some memories and some things to share about him and a presentation that he had done. So you might want to go to Facebook and check those out and see some of her comments. She left several comments there. So it might be something to go see there.
I appreciate that. Yeah.
All right. Okay, next question. We've got a few more. I'm just scrolling up, making sure I didn't miss anything. Another viewer asks, can you talk about how the spiritual value of plants can be used in environmental education and conservation? I think that was this kind of interesting in particular, but maybe how the spiritual value of plants can be used in environmental education and conservation.
Yeah, so that's a tricky thing because you want to have a lot of respect for the privacy and the sacredness that goes into traditional ceremony. In some respects, it's something you can talk your head off about in terms of respecting plants and preserving them and treating them more as beings than just objects, that sort of thing. But on the other hand, I would not rattle on about certain ceremonial aspects of it because those things are more powerful when they're kept sort of guarded. And so, you know, if you're an outsider to a tribal religion, I think it's really important to have a lot of respect for what is more private and sacred and not to ask a lot of questions that might be too prying into that and not respecting that aspect of it. But on the other hand, it's really, really great to encourage to the youth and to people, you know, just the general concept that Native people have a very complex relationship with plants that goes deeper than what meets the eye. You know, our belief system is that there's much more to this world than you can see and hear. And just generally understanding that and respecting that and sort of planting that seed of understanding generally, I think is a fantastic idea.
Perfect answer. We've got a couple questions that all kind of circle, I'm going to kind of combine some things, circle around maybe opportunities that are available to the public. So do any tribe members still use traditional planting techniques? Would they consider teaching those to the public? Are there opportunities to teach the crafts such as dyeing the textiles, basket weaving? Are there any opportunities for interested members of the public to kind of learn some of the things that you talked about?
Yeah, I'm really big into planting traditionally. I don't mind teaching that, you know, the Three Sisters technique and all that. I love it. I'm really big on that. We have some tribal members who do grow out certain seeds that they preserved, and we have a big, wonderful cultural department that does offer classes to our local community about certain things like weaving, pine needle baskets, weaving, certain things like that. But there are definitely tribal artisans out there who do amazing work. And if you are interested in anything in particular, just email me and I'll let you know who might be a good point person, like a good artisan to talk to about that. about learning. And certain things that would include would be pottery, textiles, finger weaving, pine needle baskets, river cane weaving, shell carving. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff.
That is wonderful. That is, I'm looking, I'm checking. I hope I haven't missed anyone's questions. I'm checking our Zoom. Oh, somebody just asked, is that a lacrosse stick on the desk behind you?
Yeah, we call it stickball.
Stickball, okay, there you go.
Yeah, yeah. My grandfather made these.
Tell us about them.
Oh, so yeah, stickball is an old ancient sport. There are no rules, and women don't use in our tribe. Women don't use our hand or don't use the sticks at all. We just use our hands, and so we can slap them in, knock them down, and the men carry the sticks, and they have to pick up the balls with the stick and throw it at the goal. But it was referred to as the little brother of war, which, if you think about it, that's kind of the role that sports have in our life, isn't it? It's kind of a way to get aggression out.
Very true, very true. Well, wonderful. Well, I think that those are our questions. I'm looking, I don't think I see any others. Well, thank you again. Anything else you have for us or to share? Anything else we missed?
I'm good. If there's no more questions, I really appreciate y'all tuning in today.
Well, wonderful. I think we had probably a little over about 35 people. I know will be posted. We'll have more people join us as we, as they're posted to Facebook and able to see it and watch it at later times. So thank you again so much for joining us. We're